Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight's discussion, we listened to your responses and your requests on our social media show, is based on the 2018 October cabinet reshuffle that happened last week, executed by His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Rwanda, President Paul Kagame. There are quite some significant changes in this new cabinet, key amongst them the fact that there's a 15 reduction in size, with members reducing from 31 members to 26 members. These are some of the things that we're going to focus on this evening on The Square. My name is Danam PC. As always, I'm joined by my lovely co-panelists, resident panelists on The Square. I have with me Brenna Namata. Welcome to The Square. Thank you. And Ephraim.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure having you.
You know, Charlie's absent.
Yes.
I think he went to watch the game tonight.
Which game?
The Champions League game.
Oh, there's a Champions League game.
Yeah.
It's very we'll deal with him when he comes back. As you know, Charles is also part of The Square, but he's not with us today. He had to travel for work. So before we begin, like we always do, we have a weekly recap. I'd like to start with you, Ephraim.
I think I'll talk about what's happening in the news globally. Mm-hmm. What happened at the Saudi Arabian embassy in Turkey when Jamal, the journalist, I'll pronounce his name as I know how to pronounce it. Yes, Jamal Khashoggi. He was, I think, the turn of events, because for the longest Saudi Arabia kept denying that he had ever entered or anything had happened to him, that they don't know this. They denied everything until now they've reached a point where the story keeps changing and you see that more evidence keeps coming out that keeps refuting some of the stories they keep putting out. I found it very interesting, and at least the scale of it, and also how the rest of the West reacted to it, like so how the U.S. Donald Trump responded to it, how some of the business community pulled out of what they call Davos in the desert. For me, that was a highlight of the week. It was really, I would say, for lack of a better words, very scandalous.
Yeah, and the fact that Trump also finally responded to this particular issue.
Exactly.
Rana?
More or less the same. I think it's an important story. On one hand, we know that there are many journalists who face the same fate, and they never get coverage. Jamal gets attention because he's associated with the Washington Post. But Jamal's case is among the millions that we know the journalists face. What is interesting for me about that is, again, the hypocrisy of the big powers. And how far they are willing to protect their interests. From the beginning, we saw Trump trying to, stay away from it. They got the money, but increasingly, I don't think he can avoid the pressure. The pressure has become too much that now he may be forced to respond. But still, looking at the strategic interests of the U.S. in Saudi Arabia, I don't think there will be much. If that happened again in any other country, it will be hell, like I said before. So it is one case in history that we always refer to. Quite unfortunate, but I think it speaks to the reality in the global environment where it is about interests. It's very unpredictable. It's about interests or perceived interests, and every country will do whatever it takes to protect its interests.
Absolutely. Actually, based on that, for me, what actually stood out in this whole case is there was curiously nothing being said about his wife, who was really part and not participant, but was really part of this unfortunate saga, as well as his son. It's very unfortunate. So. Yeah. Let's get to the thick of things. We are here based on, and like I said earlier on, based on requests and suggestions and feedback on our social media platforms. There's a lot of feedback on what we discussed this evening, and very many people asked us to talk about the cabinet decisions that happened. Swearing-in ceremony happened last week on Friday, and I think one of the most anticipated appointees, I think, was that of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Yeah.
So I want us to touch on that maybe to start off. And as you know, Dr. Richard Sezibera replaced Honorable Minister Louise Mushikiwabo, who's now the Secretary General of the OIF. And my question to you is your expectations of this diplomacy in the region based on this new appointment, and also based on that, there's also the fact that State Minister Olivier Nduhungirehe is now officially in charge of East African Community Affairs. And incidentally, Honorable Minister Sezibera was the Secretary General of the East African Community a couple of years back. Based on these new developments, what do you expect or envision are changes in Rwandan diplomacy in the region, as well as globally speaking?
I think, so, you know, when you look at the Honorable Minister, when you look at Dr. Sezibera,
Yes.
when you look at his track record, or at least when you look at his experience, if my memory serves me right, he served in office of the president as a special envoy
Yes.
to the Great Lakes region. He was also appointed SG, as we know, to the East African Community. And I think during his tenure, if I remember correctly, he chaired the task force. It was COMESA, SADC, and EAC, Tripartite Task Force. And the whole idea at the time was to negotiate a free trade agreement between the three blocs. And when I at least when I look at it, at least what we see when it comes to geopolitics, or at least the geopolitical agenda, let me just talk specifically for Africa as a region. You can see that it's skewed towards a trade-driven agenda, where we know that with AFCFTA, that was the largest. That was one of the largest mentions when it comes to the AU reforms. And then you also have one of the things that happened under his tenure was the freedom of movement of people with IDs across the East African region, if my memory serves me right. And that's also, again, in line with the regional agenda of free movement of people to a greater cause, a visa-free Africa. And I think when I think about his role in the ministry, and I think about his contribution, for me, it helps to know that he has a background of diplomacy related to trade, which is in line with what we're trying to push across the continent. And I think again, he also has a track record as well of regional integration, which is also what we're trying to push for. If my memory serves me right, I think South Sudan joined the EAC maybe about 3 days or 4 days before he left. So obviously the groundwork and the legwork that was necessary for that happened under his time there. So when I think about what our Ministry of Foreign Affairs will look like, at least if I can take it from the region, we have relations between ourselves and our regional partners really strained, but trade has continued. So how can we strengthen trade as our foot in the door so that we can now address these much larger issues associated with what's happening currently in the region? And I say this based on, we're not just talking about Rwanda in relation to its the fellow member states. For example, in the EAC, you're talking about Rwanda as a third party by virtue of being a member of the East African Community when two other member states have issues. So you know what's happening between Kenya and Tanzania, and how Rwanda, to a certain degree, has to play a role in that, or at least is impacted through any discourse that happens there. So I think just as a Rwandan and also as a businessman in the region, I think my desire, or at least what I expect or what I believe I will see, is more trade-driven diplomacy, where we have trade as one of the kind of like the preambles of our foreign policy, at least our regional policy. Yeah.
Interesting. Brenda, what's your take on this?
First of all, I wouldn't agree with him that trade is our biggest potential because in terms of competitiveness, if you look at trade, yes, you may do a bit of trade, but overall, I think our competitiveness does not really lie in trade as much as we need trade. But going back to...
As you go to your point, but I just want to intervene there.
I think it lies in, one, building a knowledge-based economy, and that goes with having the critical mass of skilled labor. And so going back to foreign policy, I think that we have a new minister who is taking over in a very unpredictable global environment. The region is quite unpredictable. And I think the biggest challenge will be navigating that environment. Rwanda has, over time, developed its capacity and really asserted itself as an independent actor. You can see the trend, and that we've seen it with the peacekeeping. We've seen it with the number of Rwandans in global institutions. So already some work is being done. Now, I think the challenge is how you navigate the environment today. If we take what has been happening over the last 3 or 4 years around us, you look at Brexit, no one anticipated it. It happened. Have we taken any lesson from that? Because again, that Brexit has challenged all the previous assumptions around regional integration. So you have Brexit, then you have Trump. Trump comes in and it's America first. Now, that essentially has meant that foreign policy has changed. So if America has been your key ally, how do you respond to a Trump foreign policy which is emphasizing America first? That's one aspect. Then if you come back home and you look at the continent, the different RECs, who do you need as a partner? Who are your allies? And I think sometimes we get carried away in the photographs that, when leaders meet. They take lots of pictures, and thanks to social media, you see the pictures. But the reality is, it is the tangibles that make a difference, even back home for ordinary people. So,
following those sort of meetings.
So if it's the region, let's take East Africa. Who are our key allies? Do we know who our key allies are, and what are we doing with them? Because it's easy to say we are in the East African community, but as we've seen over the last couple of years, the community is there, but whether it's functioning as efficiently as it should is another question. So you don't take it for granted that just because you're in the East African community, it's going to work.
No, but I want to rebut you there, actually, because I feel like you are saying you're contradicting yourself to a great extent. Because at the end of the day, if we try to start by identifying allies at the beginning, as what sets our agenda for foreign policy, it's going to be very reactionary. Coming back to what you're saying, in the past, we've said so-and-so is our ally, so-and-so is our ally, but we can see allies as frivolous as dust in the wind.
It's all about strategic interests.
Exactly. So if we shift away from because you need something to align on to call yourselves allies. And unfortunately, most of the things that we have considered have really been, we've talked about this on the square before when we've talked about the AU. And we've talked about RECs as well. I think we mentioned the EAC as well. You realize that if we take the approach of saying, let's identify who our partners are first, before we now start to say, how can we partner? You will find that we'll end up developing a very reactionary foreign policy, which again you see in the rest of the world is never ever a good thing. I think for me, what I would say more than anything, coming back to it, is instead of identifying allies, let's identify things to align on, and something that can become a common strategic alliance, or at least something that we can strategically align upon, as many, that includes as many countries as possible.
I think, well, when I mention allies, I don't mean that you should just say 1, 2 countries and that's it. But it's the link between your own interests and the countries that are able to understand and share the vision. And again, it's not charity. It's about what can you offer, you know, at the end of the day, because if Ethiopia may, if we take, for instance, Ethiopia as a good example, Ethiopia is our friend. At least we've seen the pictures and everyone. Yeah. Yes. But if we look at the tangibles, how much trade are we doing with Ethiopia? How much knowledge transfer is happening with Ethiopia? You know, so if we can map out what we need, what are our interests with the specific countries who are our allies. Again, this shifts, it's not like permanent, yeah? But how you position yourself to advance your own interests. Because at the end of the day, it's about what is your interest and how do you get people to understand your interest and, you know, be able to find a way of having mutual cooperation, because sometimes some of these relationships are like someone is doing you a favor. You don't want that. So going back to your question, I think it will be, my expectations are around how our foreign policy evolves beyond quoting the convenient partners to the inconvenient ones who we need for the long term. Because it is possible that sometimes, so going back to foreign policy for me, I would like to see that long-term view that is based on relentlessly, and I'm saying it again, relentlessly pursuing our own interests. Our own interests, and at the same time at continental level. Because Rwanda, as it is with its size, yes, you could use Israel and say Israel is small, but it's taken them a bit of time. But as we are, the reality is we still need quite a bit of support from the continent to move a couple of things. And already we've seen that, you know, Rwanda now is aggressively pushing for Pan-Africanism. So we would need to see that. More so quite influential countries on the continent. Because if you look at the different blocks, if it's Southern Africa, how our relations with Angola and South Africa, for instance. We've had issues with South Africa. It's a problem, especially for skills knowledge, because before Rwandan students would go to South Africa and study, you know, under the same conditions. And that had been deliberate because South Africa is a center of a lot of excellence. You have lots of, they are quite advanced. Yes. As we speak now, that is lacking. Movement is still a problem. So that's Southern Africa. If you come to the north, North Africa, who are the main actors? Egypt, Morocco. If you come to East Africa, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Kenya.
But
just also very quickly, I think you guys at the beginning were saying more or less, you're saying the same thing.
Pretty much.
On the same page.
Pretty much.
And I think Rwanda's, foreign diplomacy, its strategy, it's in tandem. There are interests that are also done at the same time with identification of allies. Yeah. So these things, it's not, I don't think it's linear, like one after the other, but I think these things are more or less done, at the same time.
I just want to add to what she's saying, or to a great extent subtract or rebut.
Counter.
Yeah, counter. I think I feel like we're saying the same thing, by the way. I think Rwanda's foreign policy around courting influential countries across the region, for me, we have an advantage because of His Excellency's chairmanship at the AU. And we've already seen the impact it has had. Not even just as for Rwanda within the region of the sub-region of Africa, but even globally. So you find that a lot of the FaceTime he got with or the FaceTime Donald Trump got with him,
yes.
Or the FaceTime they got with each other. When you think about France's engagement with Rwanda, even when you think about Lem's appointment to OIF, you can see that Rwanda already has that opportunity to influence global politics to a great extent.
I wouldn't really say Rwanda has that opportunity to influence global politics. I would actually say Rwanda is actually engaged in influencing,
exactly.
influencing.
Actively. And I say this in relation to what she's saying, in the sense that and what we mentioned earlier about strategic alliances and allies, is that if you can create a foreign policy that taps into that, or that leverages that, and the question, and this is why I linked what I said based on Dr. Sezibere's experience, linked it to the aspect of trade. That's in line with some of the main agendas that have been pushed through His Excellency's chairmanship. So for me, I think at the end of the day, it's how we leverage. Yeah.
Are you in agreement with this before we move on to the next point? Or there's something you want to...
No, I don't think we actually are disagreeing.
No, actually, I think
we are complementing.
Exactly.
But just to reaffirm that the environment is quite unpredictable, so there has to be a constant re-evaluation and assessment of the bilateral relations to sort of have a deliberate focus on countries or people who understand that this has to be an equal partnership. You know, because I think for many countries on our continent, what we struggle with is, you know, that unequal relation, and most of the time the end result is that it's quite manipulative. Yeah. So going forward, I think it will be helpful to, you know, to sort of continue having that assessment of the allies and the benefits with a long-term view.
And factoring in, I like the way you said it, deliberately pushing our foreign policy for Rwandan interests, deliberately speaking. My next question, or the next part of this conversation I'd like us to dive into, is to do with the new Minister of Trade and Industry, Honorable Soraya Hakizuremi. She's young and one of these young members of the cabinet. Actually, before we started, I wanted to ask what particularly stood out for you in this cabinet appointment? Some details that particularly stood out for you.
What stood out? I think the age was an interesting one, but then I think also the representation of women. Yeah. But I would say age more than anything. It's always refreshing, and then the reduction in the because always the assumption is that some of our ministries lack focus, they're doing too much. But again, when you see that the size of it has been reduced, that's obviously there's something that the people in charge of that see that maybe we don't. Yeah. And I think that's something that it would be interesting to see unfold, how effective the reduction is on performance of some of these institutions.
Yeah, but did you think the reduction in size, 15% reduction in this particular cabinet correlates to more effective governance?
That's
or it's too early to say? Yes, it's too early to say.
I think it's too early to say, but I think what is key is to when you look at the list, I think it's more about competence than anything else, which raises optimism around what is expected. I don't envy them because the expectations are too high. For everyone on that list, the expectations are too high. We have quite young people, and it's always, I think it's not as easy or as straightforward navigating leadership, you know, from coming from a technical point of view and then being in charge of, you know, a ministry. And yeah, so it will be interesting to see how that turns out. But of course, the numbers with the women, yes, you know, quite impressive.
Which is a trend. Ethiopia, yes, just recently also, yes, did more or less the same thing.
And I like that she made it very clear that, you know, this representation is deliberate and it has to yield results in, you know, go beyond
just the numbers.
Yes, yes. So they have quite a huge task for many of those young women because many of us look up to them. The expectations are huge, and how they are able to navigate that.
Time can tell.
Yeah, I just wish them the best.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, sorry, as I was saying earlier on, I wanted us to touch on trade and industry. So the Honourable Minister, one of the priority areas of the institution of the ministry she's now heading is to widen Rwanda's export base and also reduce on our trade deficit. And my question to you, to Ephraim, you and Berna, is that there's some strategies already employed by the Ministry of Trade and Industry aimed at you know, expanding our export base. Here amongst them is the Made in Rwanda campaign and the policy, as well as various aspects such as the industrial parks that are being built. So these are some of the strategies employed by the Ministry of Trade and Industry. What expectations do you have in additional activities that, under her leadership, the Ministry of Trade and Industry will employ in continuing with this particular agenda?
So, you know, your question was, the one before, was what stood out to you? I think two things in relation, and this is in relation to your question about the Minister of Trade and Industry. I think something that really stood out to me around the Minister of Trade and Industry was the fact that Honorable Minister Soraya is a banker. That's one. Second thing is that she had a stint in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as a strategic advisor. And I find that immensely strategic, considering somebody, based on her experience, having somebody with her kind of experience in that kind of position, leading the ministry. When we've always had this conversation, and you hear the agenda of the ministry being to drive exports, to increase the export base, and to reduce the trade deficit, to eventually, if possible, turn to a trade surplus. And I think we all know that to be able to do that, we have to boost exports, and in turn to be able to boost exports, we have to push industrialization, at least a certain level of efficient industrialization. And I've said this in the past, and I'll say it again. One of the biggest challenges we have towards industrialization, at least for the greater part of our economy, and at least I'll just say as Rwanda, has been one. Actually, it's mainly one thing. It's the nature of financing in our economy. So one, it's either very expensive, or two, it's not available for a long enough period for us to be able to see that investment or real value come back. And we know that for us to be able to sustain our economic growth at the rates that we have continuously been seeing, and for it to actually trickle down to the actual lives of Rwandans, we need to see our industrialization go up. But unfortunately, and I say this, unfortunately, the banks are not at fault. The regulator is not at fault for some of these challenges, especially in relation to the financial sector, in relation to industrialization. I think it's just the stage at which we have reached in our economic growth, at least the stage the stage in which we're at in our economic cycle, or at least our economic development cycle. We need a jump start to our economic structures and models. And I think it's this kind of strategic thinking to say, let's put a banker and somebody with some experience in foreign relations as the head of the Ministry of Trade and Industry. And I think, again, I'll say this, I'm excited because what I mentioned earlier about a trade-driven diplomatic agenda or geopolitical agenda, to have somebody who has experience in the ministry, she was advisor for, I think, 2-3 years,
Yes.
and a banker who understands finance in the global sense. She was at ING
Yes.
in London, then she was at BNP Paribas in Paris, and you can just see that, and these are in senior positions. So my desire would be, because I've always highlighted the issue around the fact that our finance with the changes that are going on in our economy. So the nature of transactions, the nature of lifestyle, the nature of, and some banks are really trying to keep up, and some have really gone beyond the curve, but you find that it goes beyond just 1 or 2 banks. It has to be the trade and industry will take charge. Expectation is that, based on her experience, that will manifest in some of these policies.
Raina?
My expectation is actually different. One, we have Made in Rwanda, which is a core policy initiative around jobs. So for me, my expectation is that we'll see Made in Rwanda really take off beyond textile, so that when we go to the shops, the soap that we buy is made in Rwanda. So I think one of the key challenges for her will be, first of all, making sure that Made in Rwanda actually is a reality. And why is that important?
Isn't it a reality right now?
No, I don't think so.
No, it's not. And that's the thing we're
It
mentioning
is a
about
reality
industrialization.
on a very micro scale, but the fact
Yes,
that
Very
it does
micro.
exist.
Yes.
Keyword very
Yeah,
micro.
but you
But that's better than negating its reality. It does exist.
you have to scale it up
Yes, absolutely.
to a level where it has an impact on our trade figures. Already it is. I mean, there's progress that has been made. But if you look at our trade figures, we still have what I would call unnecessary imports. You know, if you look at construction, for instance, apart from sand, cement, what else can you get locally?
Actually, even cement is not fully satisfied locally.
Yeah.
There are still imports that come in.
Yes, so you have that. How you get our private sector to think and prioritize the Rwandan customer, because sometimes I feel that there's a lot of focus on exports, and which is fine, because we need the revenue, we need the export revenue, which is fine, but I think there are quick gains that we could get if we could find a way of building the capacity of our local industries to produce more for the local market, so that we shouldn't be wasting the small dollars that we get importing some of the things. If we again go back to the construction,
But this is in the process. First of all, let's talk about the KEZ, the economic zone, the industrial parks that are being built, the capacity building of industry and industrial facilities across the country. I know NIRDA was, the National Industrial Research Development Agency, was on the square once. This is information that was very broadly explained to us. These plans are in the pipeline.
But you guys are talking about it from, you're looking at it from, I would say, that sounds like a policy maker talking on this end, and on that side it sounds like a consumer talking. But I'll come back to the reality. The reality is, why can't Simera produce the cement that is needed to stop the need for imports to the point where we can export? They have the capacity to do so. This ARM mining, it's ARM Cement. They have something called, I think it's Rwanda Cement Company. they recently went into foreclosure, and it was put into receivership because to recover 600 million invested by local investors. There are a couple of other investments around cement, and they all have the capacity to reduce our import bill when it comes to cement. But why aren't they doing it? Because, again, coming back to this scenario where you have people seeking 600 million from a cement company, the capital in the market is not matched with our development agenda. If you're going to set up a cement plant, you need senior debt that's going to last many years.
And this is actually something you touched about in our last show, senior debt or adult debt, as you call it. This sort of long-term debt that banks or financing that banks actually creatively give to enable people to access finance, to actually industrialize.
Exactly.
If you want to build some of these things, we talked about this last week, hotels and whatnot and what have you. We need, sort of this senior debt.
The senior, exactly. And again, it's not anybody's fault in the market. It's not the banks. It's not the regulators, because it's just at the point at which we're at in the maturity of some of in our economy, we haven't yet gotten people to come in. But you see, when you take Samara's investment. When you look at Samara initially when they made the investment, I think it was Rwanda Investment Group, when they made the investment in that, there was a desire. Rwanda doesn't rely on imports. These were local investors. But they had to go to an international, this is PPC, Portland Cement, and they had to come in, and they came with money from a stock exchange. So this is now shareholders investing. And they were able to invest a lot of money to the point where they even could close down the cement plant for upgrade of their machines, and it does not affect their business in any way. And I think, or at least affect their business in a manner that they did not anticipate by shutting it down. And I think that's just one example of, if we talk about this Made in Rwanda agenda, boosting exports, we have to look at where is the largest bottleneck. And for me, from my own assessment, I see the lack of the right kind of financial options in the market as the hindrance to our industrial agenda, hence limiting Made in Rwanda, even just locally. Like today I had Winners chips. They have a new flavor. They should pay me for this advertising. They have a new flavor called pizza. It is delicious, way better than salt and vinegar. And you ask yourself, who are the people behind this? I don't know if you know who's behind.
I know that one. It's not a Rwandan.
Exactly. Yeah. These are Europeans who came with, if I'm not wrong, who came with international development finance. So you can see that they're able to take that time until there's product adoption, and they're doing value add to our potato chips. Those potato chips are not being exported now for the local market, but the bottleneck is not whether we are focusing on the Rwandan's market or the export market. The issue is, do we have the right frameworks or ecosystem to support the industrial agenda as we see it? And that comes down to so many things.
I like that he's...
Before we go for a break, do you want to say something?
Yes. Just to... he's understandably focusing on financing, which is indeed a big issue. But what I wanted to emphasize is we need to facilitate small businesses, especially...
Which make up over 90%.
Yes, we have that. And increasingly, we have lots of family businesses that don't have any support. Yet, in most cases, these family businesses create employment. That is one. Two, I think even the concern for most small businesses, as well as big investors, is the infrastructure, the environment. How do you produce goods that can compete across? Because most of the time you'll find that whether it's the cost of energy, the cost of human resource. If you ask most of these A-listers, the large companies, they struggle to get skilled labor. So probably back at home, the amount they would pay for someone who is not even as good, you find that in Rwanda they're paying probably times 4, So how you build I think a skilled labor force, and how you, because even when you talk about industry and manufacturing, it's changing thanks to technology. We know that the production process are now changing, with an artificial intelligence. So for me, the concern is more about, indeed, beyond financing, but how you create an ecosystem that allows efficient production that would, in the end, result into competitive goods and services. Because if we, for instance, take our brand, tonight,
Uzi Collections.
Yes, Uzi Collections. Yes. If you talk to them about the cost of production, and how many people can actually afford their pieces.
So it's a different conversation. Well, we'll be back right after the break. We're here discussing the 2018 October Cabinet Reshuffle, and we're also analyzing the various decisions that were made and also exploring our expectations. Please join us, stay tuned, we'll be back right after the break.
ubuzima ni ingenzi kandi ubuzima ni urugendo ufite ubuzima nta cyiza atageraho iyo urwaye utakaza byinshi birimo umwanya umara urwaye igihe cyo kwivuza utaretse n'ubushobozi uryamye aha ntaba arimo kwiteza imbere nyamara ubuzima burarindwa burabungabungwa yewe buranasigasirwa ibyo urya n'imyitozo ngororamubiri ukora inzira ni iyi rero ikiganiro cyacu kidufasha gusobanukirwa indwara zitandukanye ndetse no kuzirinda abaganga batandukanye b'inzobere tuzababagereraho badusangiza ubunararibonye bafite indwara zose mudasobanukirwa uru ni rwo rubuga inama zitandukanye ku mirire n'imyifatire niyo ntego y'ikiganiro buri gihe intero izahora ari yayindi menya wirinde
Welcome back to the Square. As we said earlier on, we're here discussing the 2018 Cabinet Reshuffle and the new appointees that were sworn in last week on Friday. Ephraim and Berna, my next direction of this conversation is to do with the new leadership at the Rwandan Social Security Board, RSSB. As you all know,
my favorite institution.
We've talked a lot about it on the Square. As you know, the former Rwanda Revenue Authority Commissioner General is now the Director General of RSSB. My specific point is to do with the new savings scheme that was rolled out to actually enable people in the informal sector to save up. You very well know that 85% of the population in this country works in the informal sector. So we're looking, well, RSSB is looking at new innovative ways to also make sure that there's a safety net for people in the informal sector. So my question to you is in terms of expectations, how do you see this new body being managed under RSSB amongst other things? Ephraim?
Okay. So maybe just a bit of, again, because we're talking about the cabinet reshuffle, I'd want to talk a bit about I call him Commissioner General, Richard Tusabe.
Yes.
I think, Rwanda Revenue they recently celebrated 20 years. And Mr. Tusabe has been part of Rwanda Revenue for about 8 years. And of those 8 years, close to 4.5, 5 years as the Commissioner General. And we know the growth. We know that 67% or at least the target was that 67% of the government's fiscal budget would be funded purely from revenue, tax revenue. And I think the total amount was about 2.4 trillion Rwandan francs. And that's just a testament to the scale of it. But I have a personal story about Mr. Tusabe. I can't remember which year this was. I think this was maybe 2015, 2016. We were walking, I can't even remember where it was. I think we were walking from a car park to a venue for an event.
At RA?
No, I think this was probably at Serena.
Okay.
So, you'd park at Camp Kigali and walk. So I remember we were talking about our own things. And then we were joined by another government official. And I happened to become an invited third party to this conversation. And I remember this remark, actually to date, it has still stuck with me. He remarked and said he was concerned about the extra unanticipated holidays and the effect they would have on his targets.
Wow.
And I think these were probably like an extra 1 or 2 days. I think there was a Friday, a Monday, then we would skip
So these unexpected holidays
Tuesday.
would impact on the targets of the Rwanda Revenue Authority.
For that quarter.
Was his main concern.
That was his concern. Mind you, I was third party. Keyword invited. It's not like I was eavesdropping. So he said that, and I was really impressed. I'm like, wow, this is the head of this institution. He's so in tune and so connected to it that he understands the impact 1 or 2 extra days would have on his ability to hit his targets. Long story short, at the end of the quarter, he actually surpassed his targets. And I think that for me was probably a testament, that is a testament to his attention to detail, coming down to some of the issues we've seen in the past at RSSB. Just the lack of, it just looks like projects are done in bulk. They're like, okay, we're going to do this, 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 allocate this. There's no, it doesn't seem like things are done with a strategic attention to detail. And I think probably that would change, as well as with the savings scheme. I think he's, my own personal opinion, he's the right person to do it because it requires somebody who has an understanding of the finite aspects of addressing the informal sector. Because the informal sector is not just the informal sector, it's not a blanket. There are many reasons why the informal sector is not formal. And then how do you address that? And it requires details. And then also there's the aspect of revenue collection we've seen at Rwanda Revenue. The Rwanda Revenue's methods of collection have probably surpassed what we could have anticipated. And that's why you can see a huge portion of that is going towards funding the physical budget. And I think it came down to being able to go on the ground and understand the different ways in which people were evading taxes, which is, again, that understanding of it's not a top-down strategy, it's a bottom-up. And I believe that that's the same strategy, if taken to RSSB, would really do wonders for what we see coming out of RSSB.
What do you have to say to that, Brenna?
I like that he's very optimistic.
You're always a practical one. You always bring our heads down from the clouds.
First of all, I think like everybody else who contributes to the pension fund, we are waiting for effective reform. Reform that will make the institution more accountable. Because
are there
right
areas
now,
of unaccountability you feel as a pension planner and as
well,
a
I hate it that we always come back to Vision City, but I think it's like one project that is in our face, and it doesn't help that they are still promoting it. Yeah, but I think whoever, as he takes charge, we would like to see more accountability, because this is pension money. This is money that people are contributing.
Our savings.
Yes, that's one. Two, it has to be better managed, because, well, we know that Vision City was, it didn't work according to plan. But what happened to the people who actually were in charge of this project? You know, the people, the contractors of Vision City are smiling. You know, if you had a contract to supply, I don't know what, maybe the doors for that project, you're happy. But where does that leave me as someone contributing to the fund? You know, so.
Better accountability to start
yes, with. Yes. And then two, I think it has to be more aggressive, because for a long time now, they've really had the support of government. I don't know what would happen if, with the governance structure that has been in place, I don't know what would happen if government wasn't actively pushing. Because if we take, again, Rwanda revenue as an example, compliance over the years has been improving because people can see the results. We see the roads, we see the schools, we see the hospitals. Now, RSSB, we need more examples of that. To at least not think twice when the contribution has to be made. Yes. But as we speak today, I mean, what is there for you to say the fund has done so much and ABCD? Yes, they help our financial sector. I know that. They part of the, again, your financing issue. RSSB gets a good amount from the banks. But beyond that, can we see them do more projects that are meaningful investments, not just, you know, feel-good investments?
That actively affect and impact on citizens. Okay, we're coming towards the end of the show. I want us to give our closing remarks. Ephraim, we're here talking about the Cabinet, 2018 October Cabinet Reshuffle. Very interesting changes, lots of high expectations. But I think personally, overall, it's actually, some of the changes quite refreshing, quite exciting. You know, like you said earlier, the change in size, the percentage of women, as well as the youthfulness of this new cabinet. It's very, I think it's exciting. But I'd like us to give our closing remarks.
Again, I'm immensely optimistic. Okay, of the dockets we've selected.
Of the dockets we've selected to talk about today.
Yeah, there's some where you're like, But I think for trade, for RSSB, and for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm optimistic. More so trade. Obviously, there's always that challenge, and you mentioned it, of a technocrat assuming a leadership role. And I think there's nothing like leading a ministry, especially in Rwanda. There's so many complexities around the job. But, I mean, I'd rather a banker than an economist. No offense to economists at this point in time. I feel like there is a better understanding of risk. And so anyway, just in closing, I'm excited to see what happens.
Interesting. Yeah. Brenna, final remarks briefly?
For me, I feel that especially the young people have an opportunity, a rare opportunity and a privilege to make a difference. So it has to always be about national interests, not, you know, your individual interests. And hopefully, we'll get to see that reflected in how they make decisions. Because there's always a risk that when people are appointed, it's about playing safe and not making any decisions. And perhaps this is why I'm not appointed. But I think it's better that it's a no or yes. You can't just be there and you cannot take decisions. I think that's very bad for us. And thirdly, I think we have to see more service, accountability, with humility. I mean, you go to some of these institutions and the official has their own lift.
I think that's going to change definitely with this new youthful cabinet.
Is that about,
if you cannot share a lift
humility,
with the people that, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Brenna and Ephraim. Thank you for tuning in. We'll keep the conversation going. Keep your thoughts coming with us on our social media using our hashtag #TheSquareRW on the cabinet decisions, the new cabinet appointees based on the reshuffle that took place last week on Friday. Thank you for watching and have a good evening.